Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. We have a full show today. There's a lot of people on the panel, and they are just constantly arriving, as I see. So let me get right into it and bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, the Pascal Robert. Oh, shit.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
I have glasses on. For those that don't know, I can't see far away, and that is how far away my computer is from me with this current setup, man. This is going to be a good show today, Pascal. Regardless of what you think, I think we're going to be able to shed the moniker that we get as a pejorative of class reductionists today, I think. What do you think?
I've never accepted that we got that moniker. I think that's people's misunderstanding.
Oh, I agree, but I hate that shit. Our homie, our dog, he is part of the Saturday crew. Also, coming up, we are going to be doing a show on Zero Books. Me, Pascal, and this gentleman. We've been doing it on his Twitch channel. It's called This Is Not a Barbershop. And we're going to be doing it on Zero. Very excited. He was the only black man in Maine. I think he was fulfilling a quota for the state. And now he is one of the chocolate proletariat in the milk chocolatey city of Northern Virginia, or the area of Northern Virginia. He is Marcus, the Left Flank Vets.
Yo, what's up? And me and Winston both on time. So I'm happy too, because I got the crew primed. Right, we came in with the raid, and we were talking about a little bit about the book, a little bit of the questions. Who is the proletariat? What are they capable of? Was the USSR a failure of Marxist predictions? And I think we were all ready to go.
Did you see my questions? Were they okay?
I did have to edit them a little bit, you know.
Okay.
There's a few misspellings, but
spell. And Jean Bajlan does a lot of editing for me. So please don't ever think that I know how to spell. Mildly literate. Speaking of the professor, he is everyone's favorite professor at Missouri State University. He's our favorite Oxford graduate. Mean Jean Bajlan.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Jason. Good morning, Pascal. And good morning, Marcus. It's wonderful to be here with you on this beautiful morning. We've just finished recording our second episode of Gaming Materialists with Discourse Miniatures, where we got into the predatory practices of Games Workshop. So I'm super excited for that to come out.
I'm super excited because we got a new intro.
Yep.
That Jean made. So I'm excited.
Well, I didn't make it by myself. Jason did all the good stuff.
I did this much.
He did the awesome music to it. So
I did do that. And you can get that awesome music. Just kidding, but you can. But there's also one other person coming in. He came in on the bonus after hours half of our show Thursday. I liked it the way he came in Thursday with no picture, with the ominous voice and the dark screen. It was so perfect, but you're going to see him in all of his middle management glory. He is the man who tells the man what to do on the Death Star. Deep State Cuba. Oh shit. See, Deep State's got me.
Hello, everyone. You only get disembodied Cuba voice from the shadows on special occasions. If I'm invited on from the beginning, then you have to look at my face.
like right now, it literally sounds like you're speaking as from the Death Star.
Literally, it's like the Darth Cuba.
Don't fix it. Don't fix it.
The dark Cuba energy is.
Can I,
The
Cuba?
chat-
Can I ask you a question? Do you have any other clothes than a white shirt and blue tie? Because at this point, like, which I think is dope, it's like you're like a minimalist, like a cartoon character. It's like when you watch Doug, you know what he's gonna be wearing: white shirt, green vest, green sweater vest. Like, I dig it. No surprises.
Does other white shirts and blue ties count?
Yeah. Like, I'm just
Well, then
picturing
I'm fine.
those like it's all the same, like, white shirt, but multiple, all the same blue tie. Maybe one's got like a little skull for Halloween.
This one was given to me by Henry Kissinger. This one was given to me by Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Well, he has to wash
AI.
he has to wash the blood out of them every so often. So sometimes it gets messy on the Death Star.
Yeah.
And so he has.
Normally I don't have to deal with the cleanup, but every once in a while, it's like solidarity. You gotta everybody's got to pitch in and remove the Chewbacca bodies.
Yeah. It was like one of the reps cleaning up trash after January 6th. It's just kind of like sometimes you just get a little dirty.
Well, the
Come
Death
on,
Star.
it's team building.
The Death Star
exercise.
is really going for that Silicon Valley sort of horizontal working environment. So
the emperor says it's his new Silicon Valley pivot, and he says he doesn't have workers anymore. They're all just friends.
Yeah, they removed the A from the star, so like grinder. You drop the vowels, and immediately private equity just likes you so much more.
Well, Gene, I think we need to bring in our guest.
Yeah. Bring in the guest.
Can you introduce Steve Paxton?
Sure. So Steve Paxton is our guest for today. He, in addition to an academic career culminating in doctoral research with GA Cohen at Oxford, Steve Paxton has worked on building sites and in betting shops. He's been a PHP programmer and a t-shirt designer, been self-employed, employed, unemployed, blue collar, white collar, no collar. So he's done all kinds of work. He's very déclassé, I would say, and he was a contributor to the Communist Manifesto, New Interpretations, published I think in the 1990s, and is the author of Unlearning Marx, which is out from Zero Books, a really interesting read, which we're going to discuss today, and has a new volume called How Capitalism Ends, which we'll probably also touch on today. So yeah, I was really excited to have Steve on, and to talk to him about his writings and his thoughts and his interpretations of history and why he thinks Marxism is still relevant, and that the 20th century and the history of the 20th century to a certain degree vindicates the historical predictions of Karl Marx.
Well, let's bring in the man with the plan, Steve Paxton.
Hi guys, good to be here.
Thank you for coming through. We're excited to have you.
Cool.
Unlearning Marx. We all got a copy of the book. We all dove in. I do like the fact that you start off by addressing the main anti-Marxism, socialism talking points of the anti-Marx right, with your debunking of the death toll of Marxism. And I kind of wanted to start off this show by with that debunk point as well. Where do those figures come from? 100 million people died under communism. 300 million people died. It's almost like it comes out of thin air. So where does that come from?
It does come largely out of thin air. There's if in the section in the book where I deal with this, it's mainly in the appendix. I quote a few people writing articles, I think in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and that kind of thing, and they can talk about 10 million deaths at the start of the article, and 2 paragraphs in it's 30 million, and by the time they've finished it's 60 million. So they're clearly just making this up. They're just plucking figures out of the air, and they're not. There's never any attempt to or there's rarely any attempt to justify where these figures come from. They're just something that if you say it enough, then people will believe it. And it gets to the point. There's a book, I think it was called The Black Book of Communism, which a guy tried to get loads of academics to do different bits of work and get it together. And he was really keen to get this 100 million deaths figure. And by the end, most of the academics, or many of the academics that had worked on the book, just denounced the whole project, because they kind of realized what the plan was to try and get this 100 million deaths. But it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. How are you counting these deaths? You have to count in order to get. I mean, there were deaths. There were unjustified deaths. There was oppression under the Soviet Union, and there were shortages and that kind of thing. But if you're going to do, as most of these people do, if you're going to say, well, we're going to count all the deaths that arose out of the misallocation of resources, well, then we need to start counting the 9 million people that die of starvation under global capitalism every year. Because they're not dying because there isn't enough food. We have plenty of food. We throw away 28% of the food we produce. We just misallocate our resources. So, if we're going to count hundreds of millions of deaths, then capitalism can have 9 million a year just from that for a start. And then there are all the wars that go on, because these people always include any war deaths on either side. They get added in because it's either Soviet people shooting them or Soviet people getting shot. So that counts too. It's just a total mess. It's just basically it's people making up numbers because they know if they say it enough, and most people aren't going to check any figures, and most people aren't going to do any further reading, then this just gets repeated. And one of the things one of the aims of this book was to give people something that co-worker or that guy you play football with, or that relative, that as soon as you say maybe it would be an idea to have higher minimum wage, then they go, socialism, Marxism, USSR, 100 million deaths, checkmate. I've defeated your attempt to justify a higher minimum wage. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about, and it doesn't matter what they're talking about, but it's socialism, Marxism, USSR, 100 million deaths, end of conversation.
And I'd say
buy that person this book and give it to them for Christmas. That's the answer.
And like the 9 million deaths every year that people are just starving, they'd also say that, like, no, that's a failure of charity. That's the charity organizations, they dropped the ball.
Yeah.
And I think also, again, and people who watch the show know I'm not like a super big defender of Stalinism or everything about the Soviet system, but to decontextualize it, to like not look at the brutalities of capitalism, especially in the 19th century, and also ignore the legacy of colonialism in the developing world, and sort of not putting that in the equation. Because if you look at capitalist development, critical to that capitalist development was the conquest and opening up of markets across the world, which involved the plunder of the Indian subcontinent, the looting, and the century of humiliation that the Chinese suffered, and what I think it's Mike Davis called the late Victorian Holocaust, where you just had massive human cost of things. So, again, to reiterate, I'm certainly not on the big, pro Stalinism camp, but I think it is very disingenuous and hypocritical, and also just dishonest of right-wing actors to wax lyrical about the terrors of the Soviet Union without knowing, without raising the realities of what the capitalist system as a global system has subjected billions of people to across the course of the 19th and 20th century.
Not to neglect the primitive accumulation phase of capitalism, which requires basically genocide, enslavement, global dislocation, complete colonization, and misappropriation of indigenous lands. So I agree with Gene in that continuum that to look at you, look what all the socialists and communists in the world did, without recognizing the sheer multitudes that were regularly massacred in the development of capitalism, and the persistent utility of capitalism is actually rather laughable.
And I think the obsession with getting numbers in the 10 million range is an attempt to create this kind of moral equivalency with the Third Reich and with Axis powers in World War II. The sort of 6 million dead in the Holocaust is that's a very powerful figure, and the anti-communist right would like to have their own even more staggering number. And once you get a figure like that locked into the way that people commonly think about history, then it's very difficult to revise it. And in fact, I think that in some ways the anti-communist right is its own worst enemy in this respect, because if you keep inflating the number, then it becomes a malleable object. They should have just stuck with 20 or 40 million, because people would be like, that sounds like a lot, but that also sounds plausible given the death toll of World War II. But when you go upwards from there, then it becomes less and less credible.
Well, what say you guys when it's like the death toll of the Khmer Rouge is attributed to Marxism?
I think sorry, go on.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, what do you think, Steve?
Well, I think the idea that the Khmer Rouge have got anything to do with Marxism is kind of ludicrous, really, isn't it? They can make pronouncements about being a Marxist group, but clearly their attempt to they were all about getting rid of the towns and going back into the countryside. This is totally at odds with anything Marx ever wrote. Marx was all for kind of progress and industrialization and the march of technology. So the idea that the Khmer Rouge were acting in some kind of Marxist, from some kind of Marxist background is just ludicrous. In the same way that people talk about North Korea and say, well, that's got I would say about North Korea is the name, just because it's got democratic in the name, it doesn't mean it's democratic. As far as right-wing people go, East Germany wasn't democratic, but it's got democratic in the name. So they have to, they're perfectly capable of understanding this fact that just what somebody calls themselves doesn't actually mean it. But when they want to have a conversation about how they think suddenly Hitler was left-wing or something, then the fact that socialism is in the name of the National Socialist Party is suddenly the only criteria that counts.
Yeah, I've heard that moronic argument several times by right wingers. It was like, well, socialism is in the name of Nazis. So they actually make those retarded arguments.
I think I do bring that up in this book, but I think it's like there's a little dismissive footnote that says there are people that think the Nazis were socialists because it's in their name, but this book isn't for them. They've got a lot of reading to do before they're ready for this discussion. So I'm just kind of divert them off into the corner, really.
Did you have a question that you wanted to ask, Pascal? I know I took up all the.
No, I mean, I in reading the book, I found, as I said, I like the way the book was written. It was very well written in terms of making your comprehensive point. And one of the things that I would say, and I will acknowledge, point frank, that I'm probably more sanguine on the Soviet project than many of the co-hosts here, is that, and you acknowledge this in the book, is that many of the problems that a nation state will oversee in trying to implement what they believe is Marxism is that they're going to go through a political process. And you basically distinguish the fact that Marxism is not actually a political project per se, and that this is part of the problem. And I actually admired you for acknowledging that from the beginning, because I understand the value in trying to preserve the sanctity of Marxism as an ideological project. But I also realize that the ultimate goal is to move from an economic paradigm of capitalist extraction that maximizes human wealth, that maximizes human oppression and extraction. So for me, I wonder, is the need to demonstrate that the Soviet Union was destined to fail because Marx predicted it couldn't function there useful for the overall left project of trying to implement a socialist project somewhere in the world, ultimately because it's going to have to be a political project. In other words, are we reduced to having to be orthodox Marxists in terms of trying to implement a socialist solution to the world if we realize that we're going to be dealing with realpolitik that may force us to have to actually deviate from that model. So I guess my basic question is, how do you get from the ideological to the political reality if we are going to a priori argue that we have to stick to Marx's plan?
Well, I don't think we do have to stick to Marx's plan. I think from what I take from Marx is an assessment of how historical change happens, and I think that gives us a lot of clues about how change might happen in the future and how we might get from where we are to where we want to be. But I don't think it's prescriptive, and I certainly don't think Marx was right about everything. There's things that he's wrong about, and I think, and there are different ways of reading Marx. You know, we can all read Marx. I did a Zero Books podcast recently with Sean Sayers, he's really keen that we have to recognise the influence of Hegel on Marx. And I'm not really bothered about the influence of Hegel on Marx, but that's okay. I can look at Marx one way, and Hegelians can look at Marx another way, and it doesn't mean that either of us are wrong. There's too much there. Marx wrote over a long career. He wrote for several decades, and he was kind of a journalist. He was a political activist. He was an economist, a historian, and a philosopher. And there isn't kind of and also events happen during his lifetime, obviously, and you change your view on things according to what happens. So there's no kind of single thing that you can say this is the definitive collection of Marx. This is what Marx thought, and this is the only way to look at it. And I think, as you say, what we're trying to do is my project isn't to prove to everyone that Marx was right. My project is to contribute to the conversation that moves us out of capitalism into something better. And where Marx can help with that, great. And in the places that Marx doesn't really help with that, well, that's fine too. You know, the plan is to make the world better, not to justify some 19th century guy and his theories. Now, that might sound strange considering I've just written this book justifying that 19th century guy and his theories. But what I'm saying is, look, this is how it helps us to understand how we move forward. And I think, so one of those ways, for example, is lots of historians look at past societies in the political sense. So they kind of talk about societies being republics or monarchies or empires or colonies or democracies or whatever. Marx doesn't really look at countries like that or societies like that. He looks at them as economic structures. So he thinks of them as being feudalist or capitalist or socialist or whatever. And that's just that doesn't mean that those other historians that look at the political angle are wrong. It just gives us another angle to look at and to try and understand things. So we can understand things from that point of view, but it shouldn't be prescriptive. If we're thinking, we shouldn't be thinking, well, we can't do this because that would go against Marx. That would be a weird way to look at it. If reality and Marx come into conflict, then we should believe reality, not Marxist theory.
We'll speak. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on.
Well, to that point, was Stalin's socialism in one country a totally flawed ideology, attempting to go from a feudal peasant society right into communism unrealistic? Was that an unrealistic project?
I think historically, I think it was unrealistic, and obviously the fact that the Soviet Union no longer exists does kind of speak to that a little bit. I think certainly, Marx had revolutionaries in Russia writing to him in the 1860s saying, hang on a minute, from what you say, we've got to go through capitalism. We're not even in capitalism yet. We've got to get into capitalism, get all the way through it before there's any point us having a revolution. And he kind of wrote back and went, well, yeah. But then the next year, that was in 1881, and then the next year there was a Russian edition, there's a second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. And Marx wrote a new preface for that, and he kind of gave Russia a get out, and he said that Russia can't jump over capitalism, can't go without capitalist development, and we can get into the reasons why that is, kind of, if you like. But he said a Russian revolution could succeed if it precipitates revolutions in more advanced capitalist countries. such as Germany and England, Britain and America. So he kind of gave Russian revolutionaries something there. Okay, well, we can have a revolution. Once we've done it, we need revolutions in the West to give us that support. But we can be the start of this kind of global revolution. And Lenin and Trotsky were both well aware of this, and they both spoke about this around from 1917 through to the early 20s. They were insistent that the Russian Revolution could not survive on its own. The only way that they could survive would be with the help of, if they could trigger socialist revolutions in the advanced capitalist countries in Europe.
So then, from that perspective, how do you interpret the history of the Soviet Union as vindicating, sort of Marxist view of historical development? And in your book, you compare the Soviet experiment, at least in economic terms, to the kind of changes that were taking place in Britain during the 17th and 18th century. So could you just give us a little bit of your kind of interpretation? Sort of, you made the distinction, there's a political way of looking at things and an economic way of looking at things, and you want to look at it in a more economic and sort of social structure set. So in your book, what is your sort of fundamental argument about the historical role of the Soviet Union? And the kind of so that would be what I would ask.
Yeah. Okay. So as we've kind of said at the start, I kind of get rid of those, kind of address those right-wing arguments, 100 million dead and all that kind of thing, and then we can look at kind of how Marx, the accusation that the failure of the Soviet Union proves Marx wrong. And once you realise that Marx predicted failure for the Soviet Union, then or for a revolution in Russia, then you realise that can't be the case. So why and how did Marx predict that failure? So Marx views society as progressing through different economic structures, and each one kind of has a role of increasing, of driving further progress, and each one, that makes it sound kind of teleological. I think Marx was sometimes, but I wouldn't be. I think the way to look at these is that different types of social arrangements, so different types of economic structure, as in networks of class relations, so feudalism or capitalism or whatever, different types of those economic structures facilitate further development at different levels. So a slave society is quite good for kind of building aqueducts and pyramids and keeping the Picts at bay, but it doesn't help you to develop spreadsheets and ABS braking systems or whatever. So you need, as technology develops, you need to change the way social organizations happen. And really the way Marx sees that as happening is the role he gives to capitalism is what is really unusual about capitalism, is that it massively increases productive capacity and productive growth. No other system has this kind of explosion of increasing technology and increasing production, and just suddenly we've got more and more and more stuff, and capitalism is really good at creating more stuff. And what Marx says is, if you try and have socialism too soon, you have to wait for capitalism to have kind of increased productive capacity. That's what capitalism's good at. If you try to have socialism is about distributing the fruits of that capacity. And if you try to have socialism too soon, then what's going to happen is you're trying to distribute on the basis of scarcity. There isn't enough stuff, and you're just trying to share it out. You're just pissing everybody off because nobody's got enough, and everyone gets annoyed with this, and then the whole system collapses. And that was his prediction for what would happen if a revolution in Russia or any other country that wasn't the most advanced capitalist country. That his prediction, his phrase was, "All the old filthy business will be restored." So Marx was fairly, and this fits into a kind of a deeper theory of history, which we can kind of get into if that's where you want to go. But the point for the moment is that Marx was insistent that a revolution in a backwards country could not succeed partly because there are things like you don't have an advanced you don't have that revolutionary proletariat there to actually bring about the revolution, but also because even if you've got it, even if you get this kind of vanguard party like you did in Russia, you're then left with a society that's too poor for socialism. Socialism requires us to have enough stuff, and socialism isn't that great, according to Marx, at creating more and more stuff from a kind of an early industrial situation and getting us to the kind of third industrial revolution. But capitalism is very good at that. So you've got to let capitalism do that and do its stuff and produce its goods, and then socialism can come in and distribute things more equally. So I think, so from that point of view, Marx, you can really say that Marx predicted the failure of a premature revolution. And once you've done that, then you can take a step back. And it's like someone, I think, was it Jason said earlier that you're, not being sort of, the attitude towards Stalin is, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy and everything? I think we can all stop trying to judge whether Stalin's a good guy or bad. It doesn't matter. Let's try and understand the processes that were going on. We don't have to be on Stalin's side or get against Stalin. Obviously, there were some terrible things that he did. On the other hand, agricultural productivity went equal in 26 years. They had the same amount of increase in agricultural productivity that England had in 250 years. From 1600 to 1850. So there were some achievements there. Life in the Soviet Union had its downsides, but actually in a lot of ways it was better than life under the Tsars, and probably better than life under Putin now. So you don't have to be we don't have to be judgmental about this. The aim is to understand the processes, not to have to make a judgment about whether Stalin was a good guy or not. So once we've kind of got to that point, we can step back and try and understand those processes. And I think, as Jean said about the comparison with the emergence of capitalism in England, Marx looks at, in the later chapters of Capital 1, Marx looks at the state of England in kind of 1600 and says, there's no capitalism here, and that's because these things aren't in place. And then he describes how these criteria get put into place, and then we see the emergence of capitalism. And when you look at Russia in 1917, that's the same picture. Those criteria that Marx laid down as being essential for capitalism, they were not in place. And by 1990, all those criteria for the creation of capitalism were in place. So that Soviet period, as well as the few decades before it, although no one in the Soviet Union was trying to create the conditions to enable the Russian capitalism, what they mainly did was they were fighting fires most of the time. They were behind the game, and they were trying to catch up, and they had all the numerous kind of problems, internal and external. And the things that they did, without trying to create capitalism, actually the upshot of their actions put in place all the conditions you need for capitalism. And then when the political regime collapsed in the 90s, in steps Putin and the oligarchs, and we get Russian capitalism. And it's kind of, although it sounds weird to say, well, look, nobody, the capitalism came but to Russia without anyone planning it. Well, capitalism came to England without anyone planning it. No one in 1600 in England was thinking, right, well, in 200 years we could have these criteria in place and then we'll have capitalism. Lots of people did the thing that made sense to them at the time, and the upshot of that, the aggregate of that, was that that led to capitalism. And in Russia, in the Soviet Union, different people at different times did the thing that made sense to them for their own benefit or for the benefit of the nation. But the upshot was that things like small scattered farm property became concentrated into huge farms. The peasants were torn from the land. And as we were saying earlier, that was a brutal process in England. Tearing, eviction and enclosure through the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in England was a really brutal process. Taking people who felt like they had some kind of right to live and work on this land and basically kicking them off and making them landless labourers and sending them off to go and work in a town in the emerging factory system. There was lots of brutality with that. That wasn't, people didn't just say, oh, okay, then we'll go. They had to be forced off the land. And that kind of brutality is matched under Stalin in collectivization, because people don't like being kicked off their land and being told it's not their land anymore. But a few generations on, people have lost that connection to the land, and they're now kind of an urban population that don't really have this romantic connection, or this they don't know where their ancestors came from, particularly in somewhere in the Urals or whatever. And so then that process has happened. By the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, everything was in place everything that Marx says needs to be in place for capitalism was in place in Russia.
Steve, not to channel my inner anarchist, but one of the things that, and I've talked to Gene about this before. Is it safe to say that, regardless of the philosophy or ideology, that once we come to the point where we're entering the nation state process, the nation building process, the forging of nation states, that we're talking about a process in which some form of elites, whether they be monarchical, whether they be the bourgeoisie, whether they be the vanguard of the revolution, whoever they may be in whatever society, is basically in a position where they're compelled to force those who are not in their position of hierarchy into actions against their will for a nation state vision that they may or may not even want to participate in. So when we discuss these abuses that, quite frankly, we can see in every economic model, ideological strain of political thought or economic thought, in every nation state process, is it possible that perhaps what we're realizing is that the nation state as a model in of itself cannot be developed without a proliferation of some form of human misery?
I think that's right. Yeah, yeah. I think. I mean, nation states kind of developed over at different times. In Britain, I guess. Well, there was England and Scotland and Wales, but gradually over time became Britain. But they were, and France was a reasonably unified, I think, for quite a while. Germany and Italy all came much later. I guess Spain was there for a lot longer. Germany, Italy, Denmark, I think, were all sort of creations of the 19th century. And by the start of the 20th century, they were all off on nationalistic wars. Somehow they had convinced people that the thing that, in the First World War, we had millions of people pointing guns at each other. People whose lives were basically the same as each other. The guy in the trenches on the English side and the guy in the trenches on the German side both had very similar lives that they'd come from and that they would eventually go back to. And they both had behind them a big chain of command, which ended with a monarch. The two were cousins, by the way. The English king and the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar were all grandchildren of Victoria. So something happened, some ideological process happened to make millions of people go and shoot at other people very much like themselves, instead of, if they'd just turned around and pointed the guns the other way, then the war could have been over in a couple of weeks, really. So yes, the building of nation states does require somehow a massive kind of ideological
actually, if I can pick up on this, because there's another paradox of 20th century Marxism, apart from the fact that the revolution takes place in Soviet Union, a relatively in Russia, the Russian Empire, a relatively backwards economy. Outside of the Soviet core, the places where Marxism is the most successful as a mobilization force and as a governing party, if not ideology, are post-colonial countries: Cuba, Vietnam, China, again with relatively backwards economies. And that Marxist language becomes the idiom for their own process of national liberation and the development of their nation states. So there's that dynamic pushing towards the consolidation of nation states, which can happen in capitalist language, it can happen in liberal language, it can happen in Marxist language, even if whatever your evaluation of the Chinese Communist Party or the Vietnamese Communist Party is orthodox Marxist. And I think that there's a way to try to bring a Marxist understanding of historical change into that process, which is the national mobilization is often a reaction to the encroachment of more advanced states and economies into territory that once belonged to a different group. And that awareness of identitarian interest combined with struggle over economic allocation then triggers a kind of defensive, reactionary national consolidation. I'm thinking about not just post-colonial countries, but like you said, the 19th century European nationalisms were often formed precisely in reaction to more advanced states encroaching.
Yeah, and I would probably add to this, you know, the doctrine of socialism in one country leads to this kind of consolidation of a national entity, and forces, you know, it's the nation state is not something that exists in isolation. It is part of a global system, right? A global system in which power and sovereignty is organized. And, you know, the communist regimes of the although they tried, you know, like with the creation of federation, with the recognition of national minority rights, ultimately were playing the game of politics on an international level within the system of nation states. And even within the communist bloc, this meant clashes. One of the things, for example, that inspired Benedict Anderson, who's one of the sort of most famous theoreticians of nationalism, you know, the scholars working on nationalism, to write Imagined Communities, was the situation where China attacked Vietnam in the late 1970s, right? And this makes no sense if you're looking at it from like a communist perspective. Why are two fellow communist countries fighting with each other? But if you start looking at sort of the way that nationalism is imprinted in the kind of Marxist-Leninist inverted commas version of Marxism, it starts to make more sense. And the sort of auxiliary point I would say is like, and I think this speaks to what Steve talks to. If you look at the countries that had Marxist orientated regimes in them, and most of these are in the, you know, these are almost exclusively in the third world. If you make like for like comparisons, they actually do better than those which did not have communist regimes. If you compare Cuba to the United States looks like, oh, capitalism's way better. But if you compare Cuba to Haiti, then things look very different. If you compare China to the United States, yeah, well, you know, United States is super rich. You compare it to India or the Democratic Republic of Congo, suddenly China starts looking a lot better. So, you know,
they were at a similar starting point.
And there were similar starting points
60, 70 years ago.
I mean, you can have counter examples like North and South Korea, but those are actually the outliers from the more general example that when it comes to national development, the communist regimes are actually often far more effective in at least creating the material preconditions for a modern industrial society. Not universally. Cambodia, of course, obviously is not a good example. North Korea is not a good example, but making like for like comparisons makes a lot of sense. And we do actually see, the irony is that, you know, they prepared the ground for capitalism more effectively than the kind of weak bourgeois regimes that existed in places like India, Iran, or so on and so forth.
And there's a real irony in that these Marxist, purportedly self-described Marxist communist parties, they're unable to build communism, but they're able to, but because they have a deliberate economic goal to aspire to, they have the tools of a consolidated state at their disposal, and they believe in progress that can be hastened by policy. They end up creating societies that are much more competitive in global capitalism than the neoliberal playbook, the Washington Consensus, derived political order in places like Latin America, the countries that don't go through a socialist process.
Steve, I have a question I'd like to ask you. Maybe I don't want it to seem like I'm jumping the gun here, but I'm really interested in your thoughts in terms of a kind of contemporary practical politics. when we did have the Soviet Union, as both of our panelists had described, it did kind of provide the ideological and material succor, if you will, or support for international socialist or Marxist-Leninist projects in the Caribbean, so on and so forth, that spread into Africa, the African continent, Asia, et cetera, so on and so forth. We all agree that there are multiple critiques that can be made about those projects. But at the same time, we also acknowledge that having the Soviet counter-hegemon did create an ideological option in terms of developmental models that would provide aid to those smaller countries. Without such a counter-hegemon, and I think we could all agree that China is not an ideological anti-capitalist counter-hegemon in the same way that the Soviet Union was, is the notion of even having an international socialist project possible without having some kind of actual political force that can check the power of international capital on the global stage to allow the development of projects, either on a small scale or larger scale, that develop outside of that international capital framing. In other words, what I'm saying is that, is it even possible to talk about a post-capitalist or anti-capitalist world without having that kind of bulwark in the world to challenge global capital?
So I think that one.
I did ask Steve. Let Steve respond.
I did, but let me just suggest that multipolarity also creates space. That you might not need a bipolar ideological adversary to global capitalism if you fragment power enough so that there's spaces for autonomy or for team flipping and opportunism among smaller states. But sorry,
I think also, as you say, multipolarity might be something, but also we can clearly see that the loss of the Soviet Union as a state that would kind of provide some kind of assistance to socialist states around the world. You can see that obviously that's created some difficulties in some places, but also it was quite limiting. It meant there was a model and there was something to look at, but there was kind of one way of doing it, and you could only really look at it in that way. And even if you were kind of a Marxist, that's not narrow enough. You had to be a Soviet Marxist. It's like everything had to be on a Soviet plan, really. And that's, I think, it might be that although, yeah, it's taken.
I mean, didn't Shea have a problem with having to deal with the Soviet Union? Wasn't that one of his issues in Cuba? Speaking to your point about having to be a Soviet Marxist.
Yeah, and in places like Britain, there were the official Communist Party that they had to toe the Soviet line, which is why there were so many kind of break-off parties that didn't approve of one or another thing about the Soviet Union. And I think in some ways it was supportive, but in other ways it was quite divisive, because you were either a pro-Soviet lefty or an anti-Soviet lefty, and also it was quite limiting, because unless you were a pro-Soviet group, then you were going to not get that kind of, there was always an incentive to be, if you're a left-wing movement anywhere in the world, there was always an incentive to be a Soviet-style left-wing movement, because that was the only way you were going to get any kind of assistance and support from the Soviet Union.
And once you had a communist government in place, in order to be intelligible to the communist trading bloc and the communist planned economics of the Moscow Center, you had to have something like a Soviet model that could interface with the Soviet Union in order to just handle exchange and divide up surplus product.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that feeds in as well to a counter to one of those kind of standard right-wing talking points. Look, socialism's been tried loads of times. It's been tried in East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary. Well, yeah, but they were all kind of little models of Stalinism, weren't they? They were all born out of the Cold War, and they were all supplied with resources and money and arms and whatever from the Soviet Union. That stuff doesn't come for free. That stuff comes when you model. There was some variation. Obviously, Tito's Yugoslavia wasn't the same as Ceausescu's Romania, but there are parameters within that you can't move out of. And so really the failure of all those different, look at millions of socialist experiments that keep failing, but basically they were just different manifestations of the same experiment that failed.
And Yugoslavia is a great example, because that variation from the Soviet model led to the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Eastern Bloc.
I also kind of feel that you're raising the great work of Enver Hoxha in Albania and developing his great socialist experiment in a mountain resort. But the point I wanted to make is Pascal raised the important point. There are many movements, anti-colonial movements around the world that benefited greatly from the Soviet Union in terms of arms. There were also states like the State of Israel, which were founded thanks to Soviet arms, and also the Soviet Union being one of the first countries to recognize Israel and to consent to the partition plan of the mandatory Palestine. I like to raise that because people don't like to talk about some of the negative things that have necessarily happened historically. But what I wanted to also point out was that in certain contexts, just as the Soviets could be a boon, they could also be a bane. Look at the communist movement in the United States. And this circles back to the kind of issue of the nation state. Once the Soviet Union started operating on the basis of being not the center of a global revolution, but a nation state with concrete material interests, that meant that the Comintern and many of the sort of international facing mechanisms of the communist movement were subject to what were the interests of the Soviet Union as a nation state. This meant in practice the communist movement in the United States liquidated itself into the Democratic Party to such an extent that you end up by 2016 the Communist Party are basically, you have communists for Hillary. But so you have these policies, for example, undermining a very vigorous movement that was developing in the United States in the 20s and 30s because of the needs of the Soviet state. And of course, in the post-World War II era, we have the Soviets often making deals with left nationalists in the Middle East, in places like that, at the expense of communists, because of course there is there's a very realpolitik interest to do that. Nasser can liquidate the communists no problem, so long as he's making a deal with the Soviets and countering European hegemony. So I think the influence on the Soviet Union is on the world it's a contradictory one. In some ways it assisted in emancipation around the world, but in other ways it played a negative role. The Chinese had a revolution despite the advice that they were getting from the Soviet Union. If they'd listened to them, they would have kept up with the Popular Front strategy, which proved disastrous in the 1920s and led to the near annihilation of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think there are arguments on both sides of the ledger in terms of the thing. But I do think that particularly in the 90s and in the war on terrorism era, the lack of a counterbalance to American power has led to the proliferation of war around the world in the war on terror, but also the proliferation of a more insidious Washington consensus of economic development that has been proved disastrous. And perhaps now, even though China is not particularly outward facing, having a more multipolar world may create space for economic development, just as a multipolar world opened up a space in the late 19th century for Japan to go through its industrial revolution. I don't know what people's thoughts are on that.
I think that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Washington Consensus going global, you move from a bipolar system, which is embedded in these superpowers to a kind of, the parasite goes free, right? From the United States, you end up with metastasizing global system of capitalism that attempts to decenter itself from nation states. And the idea of mutual interdependence, economic interdependence, lowering trade barriers, lowering investment barriers, making capital and goods fluid while labor is not, was this attempt to transcend the nation state by a capitalist economic order. And what's interesting in this shift towards multipolarity is that it looks like that's failed. That was only possible as long as there was a preponderance of American power. And when American power became exhausted, you ended up with the reemergence of opposing centers. And they may still interact through a global economy, but they're increasingly twisting the rules to favor their national interests. And that's where the multipolarity may create space for experimentation. What would be interesting, it's interesting because the Soviet attempts to globalize Marxism was, like you said, there's one model and we're going to stamp it out. We're going to have Stalinist central planning in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Romania, in Vietnam, in Albania. And if you don't like it, then there's no room for you. And that inflexibility was another point of weakness, I think, in the former Eastern Bloc.
I think that does. I mean, when you're saying, that the impact of the Soviet Union not being there on international left-wing groups or opportunities, that is, obviously there. It helps if there's a big superpower there who can give you a load of stuff. But actually, that is, like you say, it's very limiting. We are now, groups can now look at a much broader range of models for moving forward out of capitalism.
Go ahead, Pascal.
I want. You have a question, Pascal?
No, I said I wanted Marcus. Go ahead.
Well, I guess I'd wonder too about even how your work. How do we get to the practical application of it for today?
I was just about to ask that question.
Yeah, this is something as I was reading. It was like, you want
to ask it? You have it.
Yeah. Is there too much rear view analysis in our thinking? But no, that's like a question that I had of reading through. Is like, how does this book pertain to the leftists in the United States, or the leftists globally right now, into understanding class? I think there's a portion of your book really, where you dive down into specifics of is this, what does it mean to share a class? But how do these understandings also help us move forward as far as building out that class?
Yeah, and I think, and I cover this more in my next book called How Capitalism Ends. So that's obviously more forward-looking than this one, which is really a history book.
And if I could add on to this before you even answer, I want to add on to this. Your theory of disguised employment. I think for someone. Thank you, Midi Doctors, for the super chat. Is there too much rear view analysis in our thinking? And you actually kind of posed the question. Is some of this analysis just I don't want to say academic wankery, but academic wankery? And is there something that we can actually gain from it? And when you bring up the whole disguised employment and you use the Uber driver as an example, I thought that was a great part in your book, right, where you pose the question, is the Uber driver, and this is a question to the panel and everybody in the chat, is the Uber driver part of the proletariat, or is the Uber driver part of the petite bourgeoisie because they actually own their means of transportation? And then you compared that to a weaver in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a bit of a material benefit because, as we were saying earlier off air, one of the big initiatives that passed here in California that is making its way through more states, New York is the next state, they're trying to pass a similar initiative, was the Proposition 22, which rolled back a ton of labor rights for the quote unquote gig economy. And when we think of the gig economy, I think we strictly think of just Uber and Lyft drivers, people that are dropping off your food and stuff like that. But there's a lot of other employment that is in the gig economy. We don't think of adjunct professors. We don't think of contract workers in the tech world. I mean, pretty much everything in tech is contract work, from the people that clean up those office spaces to serve the food, and a lot of people that even do some of the programming.
Traveling nurses.
I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, because also you add to the fact that these gig workers, while they may own the means of their transportation, they also have to maintain the means of the transportation, which definitely hurts your bottom line. So there, and again, this question is to Steve and everybody, because I want to hear everyone's input on this, and I'll get the hell off screen because I'm rambling. Is there a material benefit that we can get from this class analysis? I mean, we get called as a pejorative class reductionists quite often.
Well, I think there is, and I think those questions, to some extent, they are kind of academic, and they're of historical interest. Whether, Marx talks about weavers in the putting out system, and he says this definition of a proletarian is someone who doesn't own any of their means of production, and that is to contrast them to pre-capitalist workers who typically did have some kind of say over or claim to the use and occupation of some land and some resources. And when they were evicted and the land was enclosed, then they were kind of cast out as landless labourers, and that's what you need. That's how capitalism grows. Because the factory system and emerging capitalism needs a flexible workforce. It can't get by on these kind of pre-capitalist systems where people were tied to not just to the land, but to a certain parcel of land by all these networks of customary obligations. So this is kind of crucial for Marx in his definition of the proletariat, is that it's they are landless workers and they are propertyless workers. They don't own any of the means of production. So then this is a confusing situation when we get people like weavers in the putting out system in the 19th century, or like Uber drivers, or like my son who's a tree surgeon who has to buy his own chainsaw and that kind of thing. Are these people, should we count them as petty bourgeoisie because suddenly they own some of their means of production? And I think for me the answer is no, because they don't. It's never to their advantage. If the employer wanted to employ them and to provide the car or the chainsaw or whatever it was, they would do that. If it was favourable to the employer to have that arrangement, that would be the arrangement. And it's because the employee doesn't have the power to choose that. They're taking the job that they can get, and the deal is, yes, you can be an Uber driver, but you turn up with your own car. Yes, you can be a tree surgeon, but you've got to buy your own chainsaw and safety gear, and you've got to pay for your own kind of update your training tickets and health and safety qualifications and everything else. So it's advantageous to the employer, and it's basically it's only a pain in the arse to the employee. It doesn't give you greater flexibility or anything else. I know you guys don't get much of it in the States, but in the UK, if you're employed, you get 28 days holiday a year, 5.5 weeks holiday a year is basic minimum. No one has a job that's less than that, unless it's disguised employment. And then guess what? You get no holidays a year because you're self-employed. So right. These things are arranged to the benefit of the employer. So in these cases, I think it's a clear-cut case that those people are still proletarians, because their ownership of means of production is kind of a burden rather than a benefit to them.
And I think more generally, when we think of class, I think people think that it's like very clear cut, when in fact sort of one's class position is often kaleidoscopic, because yes, there are some people who are unambiguously proletarian, but many people derive incomes from a variety of different sources, right? So you could be a worker, but you might have an eBay business. Does that make you petty bourgeois?
Would you all agree though? Sorry to cut you off, Gene, but would you agree though that there is a level of propaganda that is aimed at the contract worker and telling them that that contract work is freedom? I mean, that was part of the rhetoric in getting Prop 22 to pass. And there's really intelligent people that I respect that fell down that rabbit hole of their business being their car and the threat of losing their business when the law passed. In
the United States, there's no dignity for the worker. An owner, a business owner, an entrepreneur, this is a respectable person. This is a taxpayer, but somebody who works for somebody else, somebody who belongs to an organization, you're just somebody's henchman. It's a loser position to be in. People for their own psychological well-being in this kind of culture try to find ways to reject having that identity imposed on them, or accepting that is an identity that objectively reflects their material situation. They would much rather be a fantasy entrepreneur than a real worker.
I mean, isn't this something Pascal talks about specifically in terms of the prevalence of hustle culture in the Black community and the notion that Black capitalism will emancipate Black people in the United States? This is the cultural superstructure that sort of keeps workers divided by creating this notion, creating the notion that they are actually small business owners.
And it's another way that I think that capitalist companies have come up with to be parasitic on families, on individuals, on state welfare systems. The best way to make profits is to just redistribute existing wealth into your own hands, rather than do the things that capitalism is supposed to do. Like in your book, you mentioned that a capitalist innovation, capitalist delivery, service to human needs, responding to marketplace cues from consumers, all of that may have once reflected an underlying capitalist logic, but right now, between financialization and different types of rent seeking, you have the downsides of 19th century capitalism, but without the material productive advantages.
Yeah, I think it's really telling that idea that progress has been driven forward by capitalism, and it has, and we can see that. And even though there's always a terrible human cost under capitalism, the idea that you can, capitalism is about making money, and how do you make money in capitalism? By meeting people's needs. Only people who've got money. That no one's interested in the needs of people who haven't got any money, but meeting the needs of people who have the ability to pay for things. If you can meet their needs, then you can make money. And the whole capitalist kind of competition thing is that whoever meets their needs the best makes the most money. And so you find people become very good at meeting people's needs very well. But and that drives progress and technological advances. But as well as the fact that is limited all the time by the fact that it only matters if you're meeting the needs of people who can afford to pay for things. But it gets to a point where we've now got to the point where, creating more stuff isn't what we need now. We don't need a system where growth is and increasing productive capacity is the sole arbiter of every decision that is made, because we've got enough stuff. We throw away most of the stuff. A quarter of the food we grow ends up in the bin. Our problem is now we don't have a system where we can allocate that stuff fairly or evenly or in any way outside of these kind of market transactions. That's the only way we have, and it doesn't work for allocating what work needs doing, or who's going to do it, or how much they're going to get paid, or who's going to buy the stuff at the end.
And with financialization, you're not even talking about material productivity, because it gets abstracted into ownership value.
Yeah.
And it's private equity companies, venture capital firms, they just move money around in order to command a larger share of.
And many things like affiliate marketing as well. They don't contribute anything. They don't even really contribute to the process of a person who wants something being able to find that thing, which at least traditional advertising, while it wasn't defending tobacco companies and whatever, was able to put a consumer in touch with a commodity. But affiliate marketing actually gets in the way even of that. But it's a way of making money, and like you say, it's just rearranging the location of existing money. It's not creating any new anything for anybody.
And I would say even too is like you look at academia as a third option of how there's like this expansion into like a useless space as far as like the amount of people who now work for universities that actually have nothing to do with education, and that increasing the cost of that, of the education, just so that, hey, the university presidents can say, line go up. But I think going back to like the gig economy issue, like, like they said, it's like there are smart people who are like, I dived into like, no, my car is my business. And I think like what's kind of obvious is that if that app shuts down, do you still have a business? And even understanding how Left Flank and all of us kind of exist online. Like, I'm a part of a worker-owned co-op, but if Jeff Bezos decides that Twitch does not exist, then my worker-owned co-op is almost entirely meaningless. Yeah, and I think that's just like having that understanding that, a lot of this gig economy is just like putting normal business but online, and then the guise that the individual worker has some type of control just because I can decide my hours. But in all actuality, we don't have any power.
But that goes into kind of what I was thinking about with this whole kind of notion of freedom as being part of the gig economy, or disguised employment. I like that better than gig economy, because gig economy actually makes me feel like I'm doing more than you. Yeah. And disguised employment really is what it is. You're fooling yourself. And when you think about working in these spaces, there's a great movie that came out in 2018 by a man named Boots Riley called Sorry to Bother You, where he really gets into the weeds of kind of what certain companies are like. And he uses a call center for an example. Call centers I worked in weren't like this, but the tech companies I worked in as a contractor were like this, where he makes the joke, I'm not your boss, I'm your friend. And that's not a workplace, that's the beanbag room. That's and that's kind of how I feel about the modern workplace in most places, that you are not going to feel like an employee. So if we watch, using pop culture, if you watch a movie from the 80s or even the early 90s, the boss is always a stern, almost father figure like role that they address as Mr. or Mrs. And now your boss is first name only, and everybody's first name only. And we don't have a hierarchy. It's a series of teams.
Hey, I've got an open door policy, guys.
Door? I don't even have a goddamn door.
It's all this sort of imposition of sort of psychological management onto people, which is really messing things up. But I want to kind of circle back to something Steve said that's really important. Is about, that we have enough stuff, right? The question is not increasing growth per se, but distributing. And this is something that always strikes me, and I want to get your opinion. In the United States, the big argument, for example, against, socialized medicine is that it will stop medical innovation. Even if we say that is true, if we froze medical innovation today and instead focused entirely on distribution of what the existing medical technology is now, that would probably have a far greater impact on human health and the improvement of people's quality of life than having I don't know, a laxative that works. But it would be the wrong people, because, like, again, the innovation goes into rich people diseases, right? So
Yep.
we could totally freeze. So I think
or
I think
veteran
this-
diseases.
Yeah, so I think we get to this. We have, to a certain extent, in global capitalist development, reached a point where really we should be thinking about, the question of increasing the productive forces. Although I'm not like a degrowth person or things like that, but it's like that's really a secondary issue to the question of distribution. Whereas when you were like in the Soviet Union in 1917, the question was actually we don't actually have the material capacity to do this.
And that's what capitalism does. It gives us the material capacity. But yeah, thanks guys. That's enough now. It's time for something else. And that's where we need to go to. Incidentally, in the UK we have tons of medical research going on, and up until probably up until 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of it was funded by the state. It wasn't necessarily funded.
It's the same here.
Same thing in the United States.
Right, okay, yeah.
Same thing here.
And also, when people talk about, if we get rid of capitalism, then where will be the incentive to innovate and things? But if you think of people like Crick and Watson, who made huge discoveries in the field of DNA, I think maybe they got a Nobel Prize for it. I think I've heard some little bits and pieces recently about the fact that there were other people on their team that they didn't give the credit to and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, a massive scientific advance. How's that rewarded? You get a prize, everyone knows your name. You're probably never going to struggle to get a job in academia again. That's right. It. On the other hand, in Hungary, Professor Rubik invents his cube, absolutely rolling in money. That's the innovation that capitalism.
He comes to the States and balls out, man. Yeah,
exactly. We have a system that will reward the invention of a nice little puzzle. Although it's still just a nice little puzzle. That is rewarded far more than a kind of
And I would add to this, it's like
DNA.
If you're a graduate of tech, you're a computer engineer and things like that. The incentive set up by the market is not necessarily to go into some area that is going to help, humanity as a whole. It's to go into like making an app where you can meet up with people to have sex in a toilet slightly faster. Right? That's where the capital is going. Right? It's like the latest sex app, the latest sort of Instagram thing, which I'm not opposed again to those kind of things. But the notion that capitalism, that the free market capitalism, should I say, is the primary sponsor of innovation is just erroneous. Because if you look at the internet, it's a military development, state development, all the core technology, cell phone, all these core technologies are created by heavy state investment in risky things that the market would not want to risk it, because the markets become inherently conservative. We did an interview today, for example, with Discourse Miniatures talking about Games Workshop and war game miniatures. And the thing is about that is that the game system that Games Workshop runs now is very antiquated, backwards, and difficult to play, but there's no incentive for Games Workshop to change that because it's a risk to try and innovate. The guy who invented the rule system, Rick Priestley, left his company that he created the main IP for because he said, we don't innovate in games anymore because so there is an inherent this is the same with movies. People are bitching about, there's a million Marvel movies. Well, yeah, because like if I'm a business person, I can risk something on an unknown IP. Or I can just shit out another Marvel movie.
Should we talk about monopolies then, if we're going to talk about stuff like that? Because Disney went and bought everything
and made it shit. And made
before we go on to like Disney being shit, I do want to stand down.
Don't say that. Don't say that.
Another point.
Into the Spider-Verse was a classic.
Okay. Well, except for
Jason is looking to get acquired.
Yeah. But with that is like like the development of the internet, like to even like my point of within healthcare, the service of veterans, military veterans, is one of the aspects that is largely pushed by the state, largely funded by the state, but is applicable to everyone. Prosthetics is one of these things. I think if there's going to be any type of development for healthcare to battle against like cancer-causing substances like Monsanto and Agent Orange and all of these things, it's going to come through the veterans organizations first, and then probably be applied to the wider community. So even within healthcare, yeah, you see that there's a huge investment, but why was the state invested in doing these things? Well, not too many people are going to fight wars to spread imperialism if they know that they're not going to get any help on the back end.
And similarly, the economic modernization of Japan and Germany was spurred partly by the states educating and training young men through a conscription service. So you start out illiterate and malnourished, but those are bad soldiers. So they get schooled up and they get better health and hygiene access, and then you end up creating cadres for political movements as well as better workers. And capitalism is very bad at things like basic research, at things like innovating for need. And what it does is it pursues money, and the financialization of the economy keeps adding more and more layers of abstraction between what actually happens in terms of people's material lives or well-being and the realization of profits. Like right now, the best thing you can innovate is find another way to capture rent.
I go back to the cell phone. If I'm not mistaken, the cell phone is created, the technology is created in the Soviet Union. And a lot of the technology that's in our iPhone right now is all state funded, from Wi-Fi, GPS, the touch screen technology. This is all military.
I think what capitalists would argue is that although those things have been developed through state funding, what the role of the market in kind of getting rid of the features that nobody really wanted and having more of the features that people did want, and putting it into a phone that was the right size to fit in your hand or your pocket, or all that kind of thing, it's that responsiveness to kind of consumer demand. There is a role there in the market. The market is good at that. It doesn't mean it's better at it than anything else we could think of, and maybe we should try thinking of some ways of finding out how to make a better phone, or realizing that actually the phone that is the optimum thing that is going to make Bill Gates or whoever the most amount of money isn't necessarily the best phone for us to have. What we end up with is the phone that is the aggregate of everybody's preferences, arranged in such a way that the company who makes it get the most profit. It's not necessarily the phone I want or the phone that you want. This is what the market responds to. So even on that kind of argument that the fine tuning and the feedback of whether people buy things or how much you can charge for something, the market does that, and capitalists are very kind of pleased with themselves about how the market is really efficient at that. But it doesn't mean we're getting the right answers. We're just getting we're getting the right answers if the criteria of being right is how many yachts does it buy Jeff Bezos. But it not if the criteria of being right is have we got the best phone for for our needs, really.
Yeah, many doctors.
Yeah, like for example,
Go ahead.
crack cocaine, is a really good marketable product, right?
Tell us about that, Gene.
Yeah, like I'm told that it's really marketable.
Hell of a drug.
It's a hell of a drug. It's really Moorish, exactly. You have one and you want to have another. And wasn't that a Super Hands line in
a Peep Show?
Peep Show, it was like smoking crack. It's like, this crack is really Moorish. It's like, I don't think you're supposed to be smoking that, but that's a kind of extreme example. But just because something is highly marketable and desirable does not mean it's a net aggregate good product. And what we're discovering
negative
with
market effects, I think we call that.
But we're seeing the same kind of thing with the psychological impact on people of a lot of these online technologies, certain methodologies which online gaming uses to get people addicted. So when you talk about, people will think intuitively that, well, if something is sellable, it means that it's good. But that's not necessarily the case. Gambling, and people know that intuitively, because there are industries they would go like, yeah, that's probably something
hey, look, Gene, where you're from in the UK, Steve, are you're currently in the UK now?
Yeah.
I mean, just gambling the way it is today. There's a great book
fucking betting
about
shops, man. Betting shops
the
everywhere.
the kind of the commodification of bringing gambling out of kind of a British underworld and making it okay again.
It was. I worked in betting shops in the 90s, and they were still governed by the legislation from the 60s, and so there were rules that were things like, so you weren't allowed to sell any hot drinks or anything, or even cold drinks. You weren't allowed. The seats were not allowed to be comfortable. You could only have hard seats. You couldn't have a cushion because people might hang around too long in the bookies all day. You couldn't see in through the windows. Mm-hmm. They had to be blocked out. If it was summer and you wanted the door open, you had to hang one of those curtains up to stop people from seeing in case they got corrupted. So there's this kind of very moral view about it. And then it all got about 92 or somewhere around there, it all got kind of liberalized, and suddenly you could have, and it was basically because satellite TV, suddenly all the races, instead of some crackly speaker in the corner of the room, suddenly every race was on TV, and they realized how much money they could make out of this. So they wanted people in the bookies, and they kind of dropped any moral objection to gambling. And they made, you could have carpets, and you could have chairs that were soft to sit on, drinks machines, and now there's fruit machines and all kinds of stuff.
And didn't it get kind of a criminal element out of those places as well?
Replaced one criminal element with another.
Yeah, I mean, it depends wwhether you're defining criminal as being kind of within the law, or whether you're defining it as being, morally criminal. There's certainly some dodgy faces around in the gambling industry. Yeah,
but also to one thing that we haven't discussed is the level of outright criminality that backstops capital accumulation under neoliberalism. When we talk about the Pandora Papers as the latest leak, but the Panama Papers, there's a myth, a fable, that one of the superiorities of capitalism to communism is you don't have central planning. Instead, you have decentralized allocation of resources and market competition. But instead, given the amount of money in this shadow economy, you just have secret planning. And the planning is not directed towards national development goals, but to maximizing a liquid, invisible capital for people in elite positions.
I mean, Sacklers, it just came out that like the major chicken, like Purdue, one of the Coke chicken places, they were all price fixing. And I mean, hell, that was like one of the things that Pete Buttigieg, even like the New York Times, calling out with like McKinsey, and that's like basically their model. It's like a corporate entity that's just completely geared to screwing people over, quote unquote, legally.
Well, there's only a handful of airlines, right? When we talk about price fixing and carry-on luggage, I mean, who has carry-on luggage from like 10 years ago, 15 years ago? It was a lot bigger.
Yeah, they screw you. Well, not just that, but like companies do engage in planning. If you read the People's Republic of Walmart, like Walmart centrally plans. It's like allocation of resources. And companies like Sears, which tried to implement an internal market, just collapsed because, like you would end up with departments competing with each other. And so on Mother's Day, the tool department would be putting, advertisements for hammers on the front page of the magazine. So, like companies internally plan, like there was this, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Steve and Kuba know a lot more about the calculation debate that took place before, but like with computer technology and things like that, central planning exists within major capitalist companies. It is not as if these companies run with an internal market, as if that's the most, that inevitably is the most efficient form of the allocation of resources, because it clearly isn't in every case.
And talk about centralized planning. When you talk about the revolving door between the military-industrial complex and like the leadership of the of the military, I mean, it's like, what else is that? You know, what fucking board of Raytheon exec goes into is now the Secretary of Defense, and I think also the woman that was in charge of acquisitions just left and is going straight into Boeing, I believe. So like if that's not even some like built-in structure of centralized planning, I'm not sure what is.
The irony is that the main difference is, while Soviet planning was top down and you had producers subject political discipline from planners, or from the political authorities that govern the planners, with the revolving door, you just have this blurring of authority, right? Who's in charge of the Pentagon? Is it the elected officials? Is it the military brass? Is it Raytheon? The interests of an individual in leadership positions will shift from moment to moment in their career, depending on where they're sitting, and they'll maximize for, the most respectable, biggest payday over their career from every institution in the system, rather than doing what they're, nominally tasked to do by political authorities.
No doubt. Awkward silence.
I mean,
Well,
it's a pretty gloomy.
Actually, and say there was one thing that I noticed in the chat. I've covered up the chat mainly because it's too distracting. But I did notice when we were talking earlier, somebody said you can own things under socialism. When we were talking about people owning the means of production and proletarians not, and I just wanted to clarify that yes, obviously you can. But when we talk about people not owning any property as being part of their definition of a proletariat, then that is what we mean by that is that they don't own any property in the means of production. You can own your own personal possessions, your own house, maybe, whatever, but owning productive resources is really the distinction there.
I think that's
our
often
toothbrush comrade.
Yeah,
Yes.
This is the sleight of hand that the right wing likes to play on the issue of socialism, is eliding the concept of personal property and like a means of production. And I think, I don't think anyone but the most extreme kind of utopian socialist would argue that like a complete eradication of personal property would exist. The question of housing, the question of inheritance, those kind of things would certainly be questions that socialists have to seriously think about and understand, like what kind of things could be passed on, who gets a slightly bigger house, those kind of things are like legitimate questions. But when we're talking about the actual productive forces of society, that's a separate issue from the extent that one can accumulate personal property. Because this is what they'll say. It's like, oh, you're a socialist. How come you don't give away all your books? Or how don't you give? It's like, it's not or why don't you let someone live in your house? And it's like, well, that's not really what we're talking about. But there is definitely a game that is played to do that. And I think there are easy questions to answer, like, yes, under socialism, you would have your own toothbrush. And then there are difficult questions, like, under socialism, what would your relationship be with your house?
And the flip side of that sleight of hand is the capitalist sleight of hand, which takes property and capital that obviously should be that obviously affects everyone, that is a public interest, but it becomes just another piece of property. For instance, the idea that large companies that have thousands of employees have a mom and pop relationship with their employees, which allows them to opt out of paying for birth control, for instance, right? If you accept this idea that people can dispose of their property however they like, that's what freedom is. and property can consist of these massive retail distribution chains, productive industries, you name it, then you're essentially enshrining a relationship of power through private property from the owners to all of the people that whose lives their decisions impact, employees, consumers, you name it. And is it appropriate for somebody to just inherit that much power one day because they happen to be shot out of the right vagina?
I heard vagina shooting, and I just I didn't know.
Are
Did
you
I miss something?
Well, actually, what I kind of wanted to pivot to is, we've been talking about the past, and sometimes people complain about that. But you have a new book coming out, How Capitalism Ends.
How Capitalism Ends, yeah.
So, could you give us a little insight into the focus of that book?
Yeah, okay. So the subtitle of that is History, Ideology and Progress. And the book is divided into 3 parts called History, Ideology and Progress. So the first part really talks about a lot of the stuff we've talked about today. It expands on a lot of the stuff from Unlearning Marx about how capitalism arose and how we see historical change and how we see how we can imagine really not just how to move out of capitalism, but what that means. What is capitalism? So we have to define what we've got and what we're moving to. And in one way that relates really to the discussion about proletarians not owning any of their means of production, and the importance of class, and the fact that if you don't own any means of production, which most of us don't under capitalism, that means that everything is dependent on employment. I know in the States it's a big issue that your healthcare is dependent often on your job. So we at the moment, probably for about another 5 years, we're not in that position in the UK, but most other things are, and your status and your income and everything else, you get what you work for. And most people kind of think because most of us, the only things we have are what we've worked for, it kind of gives us the impression that that's true of all the things that are out there in the world. But in fact, most things, are particularly productive resources, aren't in the hands of people that have worked for them. They're in the hands of people that have obtained them by means other than working for them. And we need to kind of move on from
Stealing is a type of work. Thank you very much.
This is
Sorry,
something like. Oh. What'd you say, Cuba?
Feelings are a type of work.
Feelings are
Stealing is a type of
Yes.
Stealing is a type of work. So all of this appropriation, all of the fraud that goes on, especially on the financial side of markets. I know people who work, who complain about working 100-hour weeks on Wall Street, and they do. And I wish they didn't, because it's doing nobody any good. And yeah, the whole idea of what work is also a problem, because people imagine that if you're hustling, if you're sweating, if you're grinding, if you're putting in those 100 hours per week, then you deserve more. But what's essential is, what are you doing those 100 hours per week? Are you finding ways to deny people health care for spurious reasons in order to increase the profits of...
I always think of that, because when people talk about healthcare reform, it's like you get all these people coming out and go, but what about all the people who work in the insurance industry? What are they going to do? And I just think of imagine like people like during the mid 19th century in America. It's like, well, if you abolish slavery, what are we going to do with all the overseers and all the people employed in the infrastructure
Think of
slavery?
the whip makers. What
happens to the
whip makers?
Who thinks about the whip makers? It's like utterly bizarre, the level of
This is
conversation.
so this is something I talk about in the book, and I actually have a quote, I think, from Obama, where he's saying exactly that. We can't have socialized healthcare because look at all these people that will be put out of work. And he's literally making the argument that we can't do something that is cumbersome and unnecessary and causes tons of unnecessary paperwork because it's cumbersome and unnecessary and causes tons of unnecessary paperwork. And this is a feature of capitalism, is that the people whose lives are blighted by drudgery and toil have become fearful of any machine that will reduce the amount of drudgery and toil that needs doing, because every time someone invents that machine, it puts people out on the dole, and other people stay kind of operating that machine, and they're still overworked, and they're now having to pay extra tax to keep the people that are now been put out of work by the machine on the dole. And the problem here is that, as I said earlier, the labour market, even the list of things that needs doing, the list of people that are going to do them, how we're going to allocate people to do things, how much they're going to get paid for it. All of these things are just, every decision in that equation is currently made by which one will get Jeff Bezos small yachts. And we just need to start looking at things in a different way. We need to start not making all our decisions based on this kind of what makes somebody who's already very rich even richer. And that doesn't necessarily mean central planning, but it does mean some national goals. It means some ideas about looking after the population of the country and of the world, and so I go into that quite a bit in the book about ways that we might start to address that. And I think one of the things that we can do, I mean, I don't think we can talk about this as well, if you like. I don't think a kind of a violent uprising or that kind of a sudden revolution is on the cards at all. It's not feasible. It's not realistic. It's not even desirable. We need a transition to something better. And one of the ways that we can go about that, the NHS in Britain is a great example of the way to move, but also the fact that you need to protect these advances because it's now getting rolled back. But when the NHS was formed, nobody went and stole hospitals off the private sector. What happened was the state just provided a better option than the private sector could provide. And up until probably 10 or 15 years ago, nobody had private health insurance. Maybe if you'd got a really, really good job, or if you were the Queen or someone, you might go to private, but no one bothered because the health service was so good that you just didn't bother. And to some extent, that's true of education. I mean, I guess there are many people who can't afford to send their kids to a private school. 93% of kids in Britain go to a state school because the state provides an adequate, it could be a lot better, but it's an adequate, and 93% of people have either decided that they can't afford or they're getting a good enough deal from the state that they don't use private education. And I think we could do this with housing as well. The state should become the best landlord anyone could have. Build hundreds of thousands of houses, rent them to people. Have a scheme where once you've paid in enough rent, you can move around houses on the scheme, but once overall you've paid in enough rent, it gets converted to a mortgage payment and the house is yours. And when I say enough rent, that's enough to build another house. Build another house, somebody else gets in at the bottom, and the state could be a really good landlord. That would put you don't need to go and kind of make private landlordism illegal or seize their houses. You just need to give everyone a better option. And then private landlords would be faced with this kind of, well, I can't make any money anymore. So that would bring the house prices down. And they would either have to rent cheap, they'd get out of landlordism, maybe sell their houses to the state, and the state could rent them out under these much better conditions.
And Finland did this with education. They said you can have private schools,
yes,
but they can't be for profit, and they can't, and you have to do the national curriculum,
and they have to have the same entry criteria as everyone else.
Exactly. Yeah. So they just don't exist. And Finnish education is a model, a world-class model for that. So your view of like the transition to socialism would then be sort of through state action. That's how you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be centralized state action, and it could include things like worker co-ops and things like that. I think one really big area where this can be done in is employment. So, MMT economists talk about a jobs guarantee, and I talk a little bit in the book about that. But MMT, I quite like its observations, but it is still talking about how the economy works under capitalism. So it's not the answer to anything. It's a good way of looking at things, but the solutions aren't necessarily the same as the ones that I would advocate. But so the idea of a jobs guarantee, most MMT theorists have this phrase, which is the employer of last resort. I think we should get rid of that. The state should be the employer of best practice. If you want a job, the state will give you a job with 6 weeks holiday and decent paying conditions, and a career path and some training to move you up through the ladder and everything else. If we did that, then the private sector, when somebody's going for a job in the private sector isn't saying, okay, we're going to negotiate your wages based on the fact that if you don't take this job, you're on the dole. They're saying, well, if you don't take this job, you'll go and get one of those jobs that gives you 6 weeks holiday a year and a decent minimum wage, a decent hourly rate and everything else. The private sector then has to up its game in terms of its offering to people. So you don't have to go and seize the retail industry and make it all, nationalize it all. You just provide people with a better job than the private sector can do. When I say just, I know this, it's not that simple, and I go into a lot of the potential problems with it and the way you get around that in the book. But I think that's a different way of looking at things. That's a way that we could potentially transition. And where we're going, we don't quite know yet. It will become clear. No one really knew what was coming out of capitalism. Or what capitalism would look like until it arrived, and the same is true. And I think I like Michael Albert he's got kind of quite a detailed blueprint, hasn't he? And I think I like the fact that there are people doing that. But from my point of view, I think we will probably not know the shape of things until we get further down the path.
Stephen,
I've just seen somebody asking when the book comes out, so it'll probably be next August. There's a really long kind of process to get all the distributors on board so that all the bookshops can stock it.
I wanted to ask you, Stephen, do you actually think that there is a global ruling class consensus to evolve beyond capitalism?
No, I don't think there is. And
take the edges off, maybe the rough edges.
Well,
yeah, I think that it's not the case that there's there probably are smoke-filled rooms full of people plotting, but I don't, I think that there isn't kind of a global capitalist conspiracy to keep everyone down. People do what suits them at the time, and the upshot of that is that, they retain their power as a class. But I think in some ways it can look much more depressing if we look at Britain and America, because we kind of tend to be fixated on past glories, and there's less incentive to look forward. Whereas if you look at maybe the Scandinavian companies and Japan, this is where people are experimenting with new ways of doing things. I think it was Japan I read recently. They've just made all their trains are free. Maybe it was South Korea, I'm not sure. That kind of an idea, experiments with a shorter working week and universal basic income, which I'm not a fan of, but there's an equivalent. Those things, they're not coming from Britain and America, because we're still focused on regaining past glories.
There's a certain irony to the anti-unionism in especially Anglo-American business circles. If you don't want to face a systemic crisis and a shift to something beyond capitalism, then there are systems that we've already discovered that can add stability, that stabilize capitalism. And one is the labor movement. If you mentioned the state should be the employer of best practice, I think that makes a lot of sense. It depends on what the state is doing with that labor, but I think that makes a lot of sense. An alternative way to get a similar effect is to rebalance the bargaining power between employers and employees through unionization. And that would also help stabilize the capitalist economy systemically. But when it comes to unionization, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to all of the attempts by either workers or the state to introduce stabilizing measures to prevent the type of income imbalances, wealth imbalances, debt imbalances that lead to an economic crisis, the U.S. and British ruling class has been rolling them back for decades.
Yeah.
I think even with the employer of best practices, I think that's something that might be somewhat true right now, and even to the point of like unionization. The public sector has the majority of or within a union. When you get into the private sector, you get down to what, like 30% or something like that. But part of the issue is that the U.S.'s largest jobs program is the military, but that's not unionized labor, and so yeah, it's kind of like I don't know, like even it's something that would have to be moved towards. But I like the overall thing, yeah.
When I say the state as the employer of best practice, I mean that in combination with the jobs guarantee as well. So the point of that really is that under capitalism, the fact that we don't own any means of production, we can't just go and make our own money. We have to sell our labour to some capitalist or other. And what that means is we're in a terrible negotiating position. So sorry, I've just started getting an echo from someone. I didn't think I touched anything here.
Oh, it's me for some reason. That's weird.
Is that better? That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, that was. It's quite disconcerting hearing yourself talking back to yourself. Yeah. So we're in a terrible negotiating position when we go to an employer, and I think that's the reason. The way to solve that is to give us that option, so that the employers have to kind of up their game, and there would still be for some time lots of private employment, but it would be better employment because they would have to pay for our labour at what it's worth, not at what it's worth if our only other option is destitution.
Mm-hmm. And I think also having sort of democratically controlled labor policy through having a jobs guarantee would also allow society to redirect labor in more socially beneficial ways that are not necessarily economically according to the market. So for example, we need all these new healthcare jobs looking after an aging population. Well, those things could be put in. Women, for example, who want to live, inverted commas, a traditional marriage where they raise the children and things, well, that can become compensated labor because it's like the social reproduction is a real thing. So we can start because the big lie of capitalism is that the market the market's going to pick the best thing. Well, the best thing according to what, to who, and to what objective, and it's always the best thing to make. So I like the jobs guarantee because it allows for the creation of something Kuber and I talk about a lot, is like the need to have like a national project, right? Yeah. Something like we need to, we had Zach Exley, who's like a think tank guy who talks a lot about the Green New Deal, writes about it. Right. Changing from using billions of machines that are like damaging to the environment to like billions of machines that are like not damaging to the environment. Yeah. And capitalism doesn't necessarily have, people have some.
There's no mechanism in capitalism to do that.
There's no mechanism. For example, if we had clean, free technology, right? If I'm an energy company, I don't want clean, free technology because yes, I might get some money from it, but the extractive model is more profitable to me. Yeah. So like, even if it's more efficient to do it another way, it's like medicine. I can give you a pill that makes you better, which I can sell you once, or I can come up with a therapy that you have to take a pill every day. Yep. And then then I'm going to make continuous money. That so there's a lot of perverse incentives that capitalism puts forth. So I love the idea of not only having a jobs guarantee, like where you're doing like shitty work, right? But like a jobs guarantee, which is like part of a national mobilization to actually do something productive for society as opposed to for capital.
And I also think,
sorry, go
on. We also have to think about the mode of consumption that society is inculcating. If you think about the cost associated with things like healthy food and the lack of outlets for people's kind of pent up frustration apart from online shopping and addictive video games, then it's clear that there are better ways that we can consume rather than the ones that are provided by the market. And between that and that could be part of the national mission, the national project, which would underlie the jobs guarantee.
I think the jobs guarantee, I mean, it has loads going for it, but one of the things is we get away from the way that unemployment is used as a weapon under capitalism. And there's one part in the book where I talk about the way that they have this, it's called the NAIRU, the non-inflationary accelerating rate of unemployment. So this is the amount so the Treasury are charged with keeping in balance inflation and unemployment. So they have a target rate of unemployment, which is not zero. If the unemployment drops down too low, they will adjust inflation, they will adjust interest rates to push unemployment back up. And there's a quote that I've got in the book from Jerome Powell, who was the head of the US Treasury, saying, well, you have to adjust things because you might have too much unemployment, you might have just the right amount of unemployment, you might have not enough unemployment. And it was, hang on a minute, you're saying not enough unemployment here. So there is, this is using this is kind of macroeconomics with people as the cannon fodder. But it's not, when you can go further than that. You can think about what is the problem with not enough unemployment? So there's two things that happen in employment. One is that you do some work, and the other is that you get paid. Well, they're not saying there's not enough unemployment because, oh, look, there's too much work getting done. It's not the work getting done that's the problem with this. It's that people are getting paid. They can't cope with it. They don't want the economy to have these people these people are getting too much money. These people are largely in low income jobs. They're getting too much money, and we must adjust rates of inflation so that these people go back onto the welfare and get less money. That's what it is. And this rate is 5%. So this capitalism currently requires, the people in charge of fine-tuning capitalism require one family in 20 to be living in poverty in order for everything to work.
This is one of the earliest things that we talked about on our show, if you remember, Jason, that we talked about, the NAIRU, and that capitalism in America requires unemployment to function. I mean, this is right out of Marx. The reserve army of labor is a required function of capitalism in this country that is dictated even by the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and it's the thing about the unemployment. If they paid unemployment checks that were the same as minimum wage, that would still be, they'd still have the problem that they're trying to solve. It's not just the unemployment, it's the money. That's what they don't. That's what the economy can't work with. Is 20% of people. They need 20% of families. 1 in 20 families to be living in poverty, which is kind of time. That's if that doesn't convince people that it's time for some other kind of paradigm, then I'm not sure what will.
And the problem in America is that there is a concerted ideological effort directed by the right wing and by liberals to present unemployment as a moral failure, because that serves to obfuscate the reality that unemployment is a structural aspect of capitalism. Everybody can point to one person who's a bit of a lazy bum, doesn't give a shit about work. One of my best friends in England, most effective skiver in the world, knows how to game the system, good on him. Majority of people I know who've been unemployed, it's been a huge psychological burden on them, right? Huge psychological burden, extremely depressing, extremely hard for their self-esteem, and they want to work. And when they get to work, they're desperate. And we see this not only at the bottom end of the economy, but I see it in my own field in academia. You can get a lot more out of young academics these days because they just feel grateful to get a job, because you go through this you've been in a PhD program, you know what it's like. You go through in the past it was like you were kind of guaranteed a job. Now it's like the Squid Games, you end up having to compete with everybody And then, you know, as you get whittled down, you realize the people you're competing against are like also your best friends, but your success is predicated on their lack of success. So we see this like extremely demoralizing and brutal thing. But in the United States, there is a constant ideological war fought to present it as a moral failing, as some part of a cultural failing of the black community or other communities that are kind of disproportionately affected.
Yeah.
And in the UK, it's like, oh, they have a culture of this, and all of this
dependency culture, they call it.
The dependency culture. What does they call it in America? Entitlement culture.
Entitlement. That's what Joe Manchin just said. We don't want to create a nation of entitlement.
Where that son of a bitch, Joe Manchin, his daughter literally got a fake degree because they felt like she deserved to have that degree, even though she didn't finish the studies.
I just found out about this. It was like 10 years later, they'd pick and choose in some of her studies or whatever. It's just like, oh yeah, this is good enough now. This is good enough now. Here's your degree.
and the right wing in the United States and the kind of they will dispatch all kinds of people to deliver this message. I mean, nobody gives a damn about Thomas Sowell if he wasn't black. The whole job of Thomas Sowell is to like dispatch him and say, look, I got a black person saying this. The whole reason that you get all these, like these people, mediocre people, dispatched in order to like present this message of unemployment is a cultural and moral failing. Anything to distract from the fact that it is it's openly a structural feature of the way that capitalism functions in the United States today.
And we've been talking about the incentives of the capitalist incentive. You need to accumulate capital, you need to make money, and the pressure on people at the bottom. If you don't eat, if you don't have employment, you can't access healthcare, you're on the dole. In some cases, homelessness, starvation. In the U.S., the ingenuity that goes into finding ways to obstruct people's access to things like food stamps or welfare benefits is really remarkable. It would be cheaper just to give out the benefits, but instead we have to put up barriers so people can't use them. And I think that we should also look at the incentives at the top, because like you said, Crick and Watson didn't need a $1 billion payday to make scientific breakthroughs. But the nature of the $1 billion payday has changed somewhat. When everything is for sale and you have the right sense of economic desperation in a society, that concentrated wealth becomes social power. And the impunity that comes with it. You don't need to take classes to get a degree. You don't need to do anything in order to get all of your needs met and catered. And people are frightened to oppose you. That, I think, is what attracts people, especially the striving sociopaths, towards the top. And that's what people at the top are afraid to lose, the impunity and the power.
Someone's asking here, how this is media doctors, how precise can we calculate the mass of unemployment versus the current capital needs? But I think that's what the Federal Reserve does when it comes out with the NAIRU. They can't calculate what the natural rate of unemployment has to be to maintain the actual needs of capital in order to avoid inflation, which is the main reason why they try to keep that unemployment existing.
I think one of the issues though is how do you define need? Like when I think of something that I need, like food, shelter, X, Y, and Z, but it's like how many flights to almost outer space does Jeff Bezos need?
I mean, he started giving them away to William Shatner, right?
He's already been in space, dude. Traveled around the galaxy. Come on.
Yeah, I bet this was a real disappointment compared to his Aldebaran sex tourism.
Yes.
Yeah, this is this is what Sarah always tells me. She's like, you know what? I wouldn't want to go up into space until we get to Star Trek times where they have a carpet on the spaceship. Like once we're at carpets on the spaceship, I'm going into space. But until then, I'm out.
Yeah, and I think it's just basically like between the needs versus like the just unabashed wants that capital is going to take, or I guess like whatever they're not willing to take at some point in time, which is like a sliding scale of how much unemployment that they're going to impose on the population.
So, Steve, do you have any last thoughts that you would like to leave us with? Any takeaways that you would recommend, and any upcoming projects that you have? I hope to see you around the podcast world more, talking about your new book at some point. But yeah.
Yep, sure. I mean, it's been great fun. Thanks, guys, for having me. And my project, I've just finished that next book, How Capitalism Ends. So that's now with the publishers. I'm thinking of probably writing something next about the Putney debates.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you or your audience are aware of those. That was it's just a bit of the historian in me. So
in the English Civil War.
In the English Civil War, in 1647, there was a bit of a break when they'd captured the king, and the Levellers and the Diggers and the Ranters were all these radical groups who started kind of saying, okay, well, we've won against the monarchy. These are our demands. And at that point, Cromwell and the parliamentarian army started saying, oh, hang on a minute, we're not having equal votes, and we're not having votes for people without property and all that kind of thing. So, and these debates kind of raged for about a fortnight, and then the king escaped, so they all got put on hold, and it ended up with Cromwell killing a few people years later in a churchyard in Burford. So, but what I found, somebody took the minutes of that in 1647. It was lost until the 1890s. But one thing that's really interesting about that is when you read it, this is really early discussion of these huge questions about democracy and rights and natural rights against civil rights and that kind of thing. And everybody's just really honest. Nobody's a polished politician. Nobody's doing this for the audience. These guys are literally thrashing out what they think about it, and they're kind of grasping around, trying to understand what they think. And it's really refreshing to have that kind of political debate going on, where people aren't, the audience isn't, there isn't an audience. The audience is themselves. They're trying to work out kind of their own role in things. So and what they think and how the world should be after the revolution. So that's my next project that I'm on.
Well, Unlearning Marx is available now, correct, Gene?
It's available now from Zero Books. So I recommend that everybody go out and buy a copy. It's really worth a read. It's got some good arguments in there, like Steve mentioned, to sort of counter some of the right-wing narratives out there. And yeah, I really think that it's people should check it out. Maybe pick it up from Red Emma's, which is the workers' co-op.
I don't know if it's at Red Emma's, actually. I have to be honest. I didn't know Red Emma's existed when it was released, and I've since found out. And I did check there online, and it wasn't there. But I'm sure they could order it. Maybe
they probably order it. We will do our best at Zero.
It's an accessible book. I want to add that too. We had another Zero author on here. Oh, Michael Albert was on here recently. His book also is accessible. When I say that, I mean it's easy to read. You don't need to have a dictionary next to you. It's not written in academic speak. So that is my recommendation. Please go get Unlearning Marx by Steve Paxton. Also, again, I want to throw this out so you guys get ready for it. Pascal and Marcus and I are going to be doing more programming on Zero Books, more so Pascal than me. But the three of us are going to have a show. This is not a barbershop that you see on Twitch. We'll be doing that on Zero. We're going to have guests like Steve on, like when Steve's new book is out, we're going to have him on.
Steve, are you going to
get Steve? Sorry.
I was going to say, Steve, are you going to come back to? We'd love to have you back in the future as well to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
We need to get Steve his first yacht. So go out. Buy the book.
And can we talk about the other thing we're doing, Pascal, or we have to wait on that?
Let's wait on that.
Okay, but we're busy beavers. Is the bottom line. There's a lot cooking in the This Is Revolution camp, as far as us making more content for more channels. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to my comrades, my co-host Pascal, Jean Bajlan for helping us with a lot of this, Kuba, I'm not going to say her name on air. I only say it on the audio podcast because if I fuck it
About
up,
name redacted.
you just don't look at me with that shame in your eye when I fuck up your name. So I can do it when I do the audio only. So once I hang up with you guys, I'm going to record the audio only intro to this where I will say Kuba's last name. I will probably butcher it, but he won't look at me with that disapproving Kuba stare.
Cuba Libre.
So thank you, Dr. No, we're going to call you Dr. Paxton.
Okay. It's
Here,
not true.
you're Dr. Paxton. Thank you, guys. And we are out.
Okay.